The year is 1857. On a parade ground in northern India, 85 soldiers of the British East India Company refused to touch their new rifle cartridges. Within 24 hours, the largest empire in human history is on fire. Within a month, London will not know if India still belongs to it. This is not the only time it happens. Across 3 centuries and 4 continents, ordinary people in ordinary places will look up at the Union Jack flying over their homes and decide, on specific mornings you can still mark on a calendar, that today is the day it comes down. Farmers in slouch hats, tribesmen in the snow, school teachers with homemade bombs, Zulu warriors carrying cowhide shields against the best rifles in the world. 10 uprisings. 10 moments when the largest empire ever built came closer to ending than its own history books will ever fully admit. These are their stories, in the order they happened. Section 1. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny / First War of Independence. By 1857, the British East India Company ruled most of the Indian subcontinent. It did not rule India with its own soldiers. It ruled India with Indian soldiers. In the Bengal army alone, there were about 135,000 Indian troops and only around 24,000 Europeans. Across the whole subcontinent, there were just 35,000 British soldiers, and they were scattered in small pockets from the Punjab to Bengal. If the Indian troops ever turned on their officers in large numbers, the British had almost nothing on the ground to stop them. In the spring of 1857, that is exactly what began to happen. The spark was a rifle. The company was issuing a new weapon called the Pattern 1853 Enfield, and to load it, a soldier had to bite open a paper cartridge coated in grease. A rumour spread through the barracks that the grease was made from a mix of cow fat and pig fat. For a Hindu soldier, touching cow fat to his mouth was a terrible religious insult. For a Muslim soldier, pig fat was the same. Both men felt the British were trying to break their religion on purpose. The company quickly said soldiers could grease their own cartridges with beeswax and vegetable oil, but the damage was done. The trust was gone. On April 24, 1857, in the town of Meerut, 40 miles north of Delhi, a British officer called Lieutenant Colonel George Carmichael Smith ordered 90 troopers of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry to take the new cartridges on a training parade. 85 of them refused. They were arrested, court-martialed, and on 9th of May they were paraded in front of the whole Meerut garrison, stripped of their uniforms, put in iron shackles, and marched to jail. Thousands of their fellow soldiers were made to watch. A young British officer named Hugh Gough was warned that same night by a sepoy that a mutiny was coming. He told his commanders. They did nothing. The next day was Sunday, May 10th, 1857. Most of the British officers in Meerut were getting ready for church. Most of the British soldiers were off duty in the bazaar or the canteen. Around 5 in the evening, the men of the 3rd Light Cavalry grabbed their weapons, rode to the jail, smashed it open, and freed their 85 comrades, along with around 1,200 other prisoners. The 11th and 20th Native Infantry joined them. Lieutenant Colonel John Finnis tried to ride up and calm his men. They shot him dead on the parade ground. He was the first British officer killed in the rebellion. Before the night was over, 4 British men, 8 women and 8 children had been killed in Meerut. So had about 50 Indian servants who tried to protect their employers. The British troops in town were slow and confused, and by the time they got organised, the mutineers were already gone. They rode straight for Delhi. Delhi mattered for one reason above all others. It was the old seat of the Mughal emperors, and an 82-year-old man called Bahadur Shah Zafar still lived there on a small pension from the British. He was the last shadow of a dynasty that had once ruled almost the whole of India. The rebels reached the city on the morning of the 11th of May and stood beneath his palace windows, calling on him to lead them. At first he hesitated, then he agreed. The 3 Bengal infantry regiments already stationed in Delhi turned on their officers and joined the mutiny. By the end of that day, Delhi was in rebel hands, and an Indian emperor sat on the Mughal throne again. The company was caught completely by surprise. Word of the Meerut revolt spread along the Gangetic plain like fire in dry grass. Sepoys rose in Aligarh, in Lucknow, in Kanpur, in Jhansi, in Gwalior. 54 of the Bengal Army's 74 regular infantry regiments mutinied. All 10 of the Bengal light cavalry regiments mutinied. A ruler called Nana Sahib took charge of the rebels at Kanpur. A woman called Rani Lakshmi Bai, the Queen of Jhansi, led her own forces in central India after the company had refused to let her adopted son inherit the throne. The widowed Begum Hazrat Mahal took the lead in Lucknow for her young son. This was no longer just an army mutiny. Ordinary peasants, craftsmen and landowners joined in. Old rulers who had lost their kingdoms to the company saw their chance to take them back. The British, with their scattered garrisons and their slow-arriving reinforcements, were now fighting for their survival in northern India. They held a ridge outside Delhi for months and waited for troops to come down from the Punjab. At Lucknow and Kanpur, small groups of British soldiers, women and children were trapped inside fortified buildings under siege, with food and water running out. At Kanpur, a deal for safe passage turned into a massacre at the boats on the river. The killings on both sides were savage, and the stories of them poisoned British and Indian memory for 100 years to come. For a few months in that terrible summer of 1857, a real question hung in the air over the subcontinent. It was a question no British officer in India had ever expected to have to ask. Could the company actually hold on? But 1857 was not the first time the red-coated British Army had been caught off guard by people they thought they could rule forever. 82 years earlier, on the other side of the world, another set of ordinary men had picked up their muskets and told London they would not be taxed, governed, or bossed around by a king across the sea. They were farmers, shopkeepers and tradesmen, not professional soldiers, and they were about to hand Britain the single biggest defeat in the entire history of its empire. Section 2. The American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. In 1775, Britain owned the greatest empire on earth. Its red-coated soldiers had beaten the French out of Canada, crushed armies in India, and filled the oceans with Royal Navy ships. No country in Europe looked strong enough to challenge it, and yet within 8 years, the British would lose 13 of their most valuable colonies to a scruffy, half-organised army of farmers and tradesmen on the other side of the Atlantic. It is the single biggest thing that ever happened to the British Empire. It had never lost a pre-war possession of that size before. It would not lose one on that scale again until the 20th century. The trouble began with money. Britain had just fought the 7 Years' War against France and was deep in debt. Parliament in London decided that the American colonies should help pay the bill. A series of new taxes came down from across the ocean. The Stamp Act in 1765, the Townshend Acts in 1767, a tax on tea. To people in London, these seemed fair. To people in Boston and Philadelphia and Virginia, they seemed like theft by a government they had no vote in. A slogan started showing up in colonial newspapers: "No taxation without representation." Things turned violent, slowly, then all at once. In 1770, British soldiers in Boston fired into a crowd and killed 5 men, in what became known as the Boston Massacre. In 1773, colonists dressed as Mohawk men boarded ships in Boston Harbour and threw 342 chests of British tea into the water. Parliament hit back hard. It closed the port of Boston. It stripped Massachusetts of self-government. The colonists called these laws the Intolerable Acts. They formed a shadow government called the Continental Congress and started training ordinary men in the countryside to fight. These part-time soldiers called themselves Minutemen because they were supposed to be ready at a minute's notice. On the night of April 18, 1775, the British commander in Boston, General Thomas Gage, sent about 700 soldiers out of the city under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. Their orders were to march 20 miles west to the town of Concord, where the colonists had hidden a large store of weapons and gunpowder. The colonists had spies. They knew the soldiers were coming. A silversmith named Paul Revere and another rider named William Dawes galloped through the night, stopping at every farmhouse to warn the militias. By the time Smith's men reached the town of Lexington at sunrise on April 19th, about 70 armed colonists under Captain John Parker were standing on the village green waiting for them. Nobody knows for certain who pulled the trigger first. Someone did. A volley of British musket fire crashed across the green. 8 American militiamen fell dead. 10 more were wounded. The British marched on to Concord and smashed what supplies they could find. But by then, every church bell in the area was ringing the alarm, and thousands of armed farmers were pouring out of the countryside. On the long march back to Boston, the British column was shot at from behind every tree, fence and stone wall along the road. By the time they staggered back into the city, 73 British soldiers were dead, 174 were wounded, and 26 were missing. The Americans had lost 49 dead and 41 wounded. The war had started. A little more than a year later, on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress did the unthinkable and signed the Declaration of Independence. A former Virginia planter named George Washington was given command of the Continental Army. For the first 2 years, he mostly lost. His army was poorly fed, badly clothed, often barefoot in the snow, and almost always short of powder and shot. The turning point came in October 1777, at a place called Saratoga in upstate New York, where an entire British army under General John Burgoyne was surrounded and forced to surrender. That shocked the world. It also convinced the French government, which hated Britain, to openly join the Americans in 1778. French money, French ships, and French soldiers began pouring in. The end came at a small tobacco port in Virginia called Yorktown. In the summer of 1781, the British general Lord Charles Cornwallis marched his army there to rest and resupply. He expected the Royal Navy to come pick him up. What he got instead was a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, which sailed into Chesapeake Bay and drove off a British relief fleet at the Battle of the Capes on September 5th. Washington and the French general Rochambeau, with about 17,000 troops between them, raced south and surrounded Cornwallis on land. For 3 weeks, French and American cannon pounded the British positions. On October 14th, soldiers under a young officer named Alexander Hamilton stormed one of the last British strongholds. Cornwallis tried to escape across the river in small boats. A storm blew in and ruined the plan. On October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. More than 7,000 British and German soldiers laid down their weapons in a field outside Yorktown. Cornwallis himself refused to attend the ceremony and sent a deputy in his place. When word reached London a month later, the Prime Minister, Lord North, was said to have paced the floor, crying, "Oh God, it is all over. It is all over." On the 3rd of September 1783, British diplomats signed the Treaty of Paris. They formally recognised the United States of America as a free and independent country. An empire had been broken in half. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even as the British licked their wounds and swore they would never be humiliated like that again, another disaster was quietly waiting for them in a place they had not yet properly invaded. It would come in a frozen mountain pass on the other side of the world, and it would make Yorktown look like a warm afternoon. Section 3. The First Anglo-Afghan War and 1842. Retreat from Kabul. In the 1830s, the men who ran British India began losing sleep over a map. To the north of their territory sat Afghanistan, a country of high mountains, freezing winters, and proud tribes who answered to no foreign king. Beyond Afghanistan sat the Russian Empire, pushing steadily south through Central Asia. London was convinced that sooner or later the Russians would try to march through Afghanistan and into India itself. The British did not wait to find out. In 1838, they decided to invade Afghanistan first, kick out the ruling emir Dost Muhammad Khan, and put a friendlier man called Shah Shuja on the throne in his place. It was one of the worst decisions in the history of the British Empire. The invasion itself went easily enough. An enormous force called the Army of the Indus, about 21,000 soldiers plus 38,000 camp followers and 30,000 camels, marched through the mountain passes in late 1838 and stormed the fortress of Ghazni in July 1839. By August, Shah Shuja was sitting on the throne in Kabul under British guns. Dost Muhammad eventually surrendered and was sent into comfortable exile in India. For nearly 2 years, British officers in Kabul threw cricket matches, horse races, and amateur theatre evenings. They acted like a garrison of conquerors. They forgot that they were sitting on top of a country that had not agreed to be conquered. The trouble began in November 1841. On the 2nd of that month, a mob in Kabul broke into the house of a senior British political officer named Alexander Burnes and hacked him to death in the street. The British commander in the city was a sickly, indecisive Major General called William Elphinstone. He was almost 60, he was in poor health, and one of his own colleagues had already called him the most incompetent soldier that was to be found amongst all the officers of requisite rank. Elphinstone did not send troops to punish the rioters. He did nothing. His hesitation told the Afghan tribes that the British could be beaten. Within weeks, the hills around Kabul were full of armed fighters under Dost Muhammad's son, a clever and ruthless chief named Akbar Khan. The British garrison, poorly sited outside the city walls, found its supply lines cut and its food running low. The chief British envoy, William Macnaghten, tried to negotiate a safe passage out. On December 23, 1841, he went to meet Akbar Khan in person. Akbar's men seized him, shot him dead, and dragged his mutilated body through the streets of Kabul. Elphinstone did nothing about that either. On January 1, 1842, he signed a surrender agreement. The British would hand over most of their gunpowder, their best muskets, and most of their cannon. In return, Akbar Khan promised them safe passage to the nearest British garrison at Jalalabad, 90 miles away through the mountains in the dead of winter. At first light on January 6, 1842, the column began to move out of Kabul. It contained about 4,500 soldiers, including one British battalion, the 44th Regiment of Foot, along with 3 regiments of Bengal native infantry and smaller cavalry and artillery units. Behind them trailed around 12,000 camp followers, many of them women, children, Indian servants, and the families of the sepoys. The moment the last rearguard left the cantonment, Afghan tribesmen moved in behind them, firing from the walls and setting the buildings on fire. The promised safe passage was already a lie. What followed happened over just 7 days. On the first night, many of the camp followers froze to death in the open snow, because the British had not been allowed to bring their tents. On the second day, the column entered the narrow Kurd-Kabul Pass, a 5-mile defile with steep cliffs on either side. Tribesmen called Ghilzais lined the heights above and fired down with their long muskets called Jaziles. About 3,000 people were killed in that one gorge. By the evening of January 9th, the column had only moved 25 miles, and already 3,000 people were dead. On January 11th, Akbar Khan invited Elphinstone and his second-in-command, Brigadier Shelton, to come and negotiate. Both men were taken hostage and never returned. Command passed to Brigadier Onkatil. By January 12th, the column was down to about 200 fighting soldiers and 2,000 camp followers. They reached a place called Jugdaluk and found the road blocked by thorn branches cut and piled high by the tribesmen. Men clawed at the barrier with their bare hands while being shot from above. Only a handful broke through. On the morning of 13th January, the last organised group made its stand on a snowy hilltop just outside a village called Gandamak. It was 20 officers and 45 soldiers, almost all from the 44th Foot. Between them, they had about 20 working muskets and 2 rounds of ammunition per man. The Afghans called on them to surrender. A British sergeant shouted back the reply, "Not bloody likely." They were shot down where they stood. Only a tiny handful were taken alive, including a captain's suitor who had wrapped the regimental colours around his body under his coat to keep them from the enemy. That same afternoon, a lookout on the walls of Jalalabad saw a single figure on a dying pony moving slowly across the plain. It was Assistant Surgeon William Bryden. Part of his skull had been sliced away by a sword, but had been saved because he had stuffed a magazine inside his hat. When they brought him in and asked where the army was, he is said to have answered simply, "I am the army." Out of roughly 16,000 people who had left Kabul 1 week before, only about a dozen European hostages, some sepoy survivors, and that one exhausted surgeon remained. News of the disaster left London in shock and reached India with devastating effect. The British had always told themselves that no local army could destroy them in open country. That story was now dead in the snow somewhere between Kabul and Jalalabad. 37 years later, on the other side of the world, in the tall grass of southern Africa, the British were about to learn the same lesson all over again. This time, the men doing the teaching would be armed mostly with cowhide shields and stabbing spears. Section 4. The Anglo-Zulu War and Battle of Isandlwana, 1879. By the late 1870s, the British wanted southern Africa to look like Canada. They wanted one big federation, one set of laws, one source of cheap labour for the diamond mines and the sugar plantations on the coast. Two things stood in the way. One was the Boer republics settled by stubborn Dutch-speaking farmers. The other was the Zulu kingdom. The Zulus were ruled by a king named Cetshwayo, and Cetshwayo commanded one of the most disciplined African armies the continent had ever produced, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 men, organised into regiments by age group. A man called Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, decided that this kingdom had to go. Frere did not wait for London to agree. In December 1878, he invented a quarrel out of a minor border incident and presented Cetshwayo with an ultimatum that was designed from the start to be impossible to accept. The Zulu king had 30 days to disband his entire army, give up his system of military training, and pay reparations. No king who wished to remain a king could agree to that. Cetshwayo did not reply. Frere did not send the news of the ultimatum to London until it was far too late for the British government to call the whole thing off. On January 11, 1879, a British force under Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford crossed the Buffalo River and invaded Zululand. Chelmsford split his troops into 3 columns and pushed into the country. He was an experienced officer, but he had spent his career fighting poorly armed opponents, and he did not respect the Zulu as real soldiers. He thought the main problem was going to be finding them, not beating them. On the 20th of January, his central column reached a strange rocky outcrop that looked like a crouching lion called Isandlwana. He ordered the camp pitched there. Against the standard rule of his own army, he did not entrench the camp. He did not form a wagon laager. He believed he would only be there for a short time, and he believed the Zulus would never dare attack a British force in the open. On the morning of the 22nd of January 1879, Chelmsford made the worst decision of his career. He had received reports of Zulu movement to the east, so he split his already divided force in half again and marched off with most of the column to find them. He left around 1,800 men behind at Isandlwana under the command of a Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pillane. A separate British officer named Anthony Durnford arrived later that morning with a few hundred mounted troops and African auxiliaries. What none of them knew was that the main Zulu army, around 20,000 warriors under a commander named Nchingwayo Kamahole, was already hidden in a valley only a few miles to the northeast, sitting silently on the ground, waiting for the right day to attack. They were discovered by accident. A small British scouting patrol chased some Zulu cattle over a ridge around 11 in the morning and looked down into the valley. They saw a sight that no British officer had ever expected to see. 20,000 men in rows, sitting on their shields, waiting. The Zulus saw the patrol at the same moment. They stood up as one and began to move. They came on in the formation they had used since the days of the great Zulu king Shaka, the horns of the buffalo. The main body, the chest, moved straight at the camp. 2 wings, the horns, raced out to the left and the right to surround it from behind. At first, the thin line of British redcoats held. They had Martini Henry breech-loading rifles that could fire 12 rounds a minute. The Zulus were mostly armed with cowhide shields and short stabbing spears called iklua, and they had to cross open ground under fire. For a little while, the volleys from the 24th foot tore great holes in the charging lines, and the Zulus actually went to ground, taking shelter from the bullets. But the British firing line was stretched too thin and was placed too far from the ammunition wagons. When the men began to run low on cartridges, the firing slackened. The Zulu wings closed in from behind. The horns met. The camp was surrounded. What followed was not really a battle anymore. It was a massacre. The British fell back toward the camp in small groups and were cut down. Durnford and a band of men tried to hold one side of the wagon park until their ammunition ran out, then fought hand to hand until they were overwhelmed. Pauline was killed. Of the roughly 1,700 men in the camp, over 1,300 were killed, including 52 British officers and 806 non-commissioned ranks of the 24th Foot. About 471 Africans fighting on the British side also died. The Zulus carried away around 1,000 modern rifles and the entire ammunition reserve of the column. Zulu losses were brutal too, estimated at around 2,000 killed outright. When Cetshwayo later heard the casualty count, he is reported to have said that an assegai had been thrust into the belly of the nation. News of Isandlwana reached London on the 11th of February 1879. It hit the country like a physical blow. A Victorian British army, armed with the best rifles in the world, had been wiped out by men the newspapers had called spear-wielding savages. It remains the worst defeat the British Army ever suffered against an indigenous opponent anywhere in the world. A badly embarrassed British government poured reinforcements into South Africa, and by July, the Zulu kingdom had been crushed at the final Battle of Ulundi, and Cetshwayo captured. The British won the war. But the idea that the red-coated British army was unbeatable in open battle had died on that rocky slope on January 22nd. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 years later, in the same corner of southern Africa, the British would learn the same lesson again from an entirely different kind of enemy. This time, the men who beat them would not be warriors in cowhide regiments. They would be farmers in slouch hats carrying hunting rifles, and they would do it in a single afternoon. Section 5. The First Boer War / Transvaal Rebellion, 1880 to 1881. In 1877, less than 2 years before the disaster at Isandlwana, the British had quietly annexed a country in southern Africa called the Transvaal. It was a small, poor, landlocked republic run by Dutch-speaking farmers called Boers, or, in their own language, Afrikaners. The man who ran the British scheme, Lord Carnarvon, wanted one big federation of all the southern African territories under the British flag, and the independent Boer Republic was in his way. The Boers, who had trekked north from the Cape decades earlier specifically to get away from British rule, were furious. For 3 years they swallowed their anger and waited. In December 1880, they stopped waiting. The spark was an unpaid tax. In November 1880, a local British magistrate in a town called Potchefstroom seized a wagon belonging to a Boer named Piet Bezuidenhout over a tax bill. When the wagon was put up for auction, 100 armed Boers rode into town, drove off the officials and took the wagon back. On the 13th of December, the Boer leaders gathered, elected their own government and declared that the South African Republic was independent again. 3 days later, on December 16th, Boers fired the first shots of the war at Potchefstroom. Within a week, every small British garrison scattered across the Transvaal was cut off and under siege. The first real disaster came on the 20th of December 1880 at a stream called Bronkhorstspruit. A column of around 260 men from the 94th Regiment of Foot was marching westward toward Pretoria, led by a lieutenant colonel named Philip Robert Anstruther. The regimental band was playing a popular song called Kiss Me, Mother Darling. They had no idea a Boer commando of around 250 men, under a commander named Franz Hubert, was waiting for them behind the cover of a low ridge. A Boer envoy rode out, very politely, and told Anstruther that the territory was now a Boer republic, and that he had to turn back. Anstruther, equally politely, refused, and ordered his men to prepare their ammunition. The Boers opened fire from about 200 yards away, Within 15 minutes, around 156 British soldiers were killed or wounded. Anstruther himself was shot through the leg and surrendered before dying a few days later. The Boers, firing from cover, had lost only about 2 men killed and 5 wounded. The Boers were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, hunters and frontier fighters. They wore no uniform. They wore their own jackets, trousers and slouch hats. They rode their own ponies. They carried their own hunting rifles. Every one of them had grown up shooting game at long range and had learned from childhood to move through rough country without being seen. They had watched the British Army struggle against the Zulus the year before and had taken careful notes. They understood one thing the British officers in red coats still refused to understand. A man lying behind a rock with a modern rifle and a good eye could kill a soldier on open ground long before the soldier could reach him. The British sent a force under Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley to march north from Natal and relieve their trapped garrisons. Colley was an intelligent, brave and overconfident man. He did not wait for the large reinforcements that were coming. He advanced with the troops he had. On the 28th of January, 1881, he attacked the Boer positions at a pass called Lang's Neck and was driven off with heavy losses. On the 8th of February, he tried again at a place called Schoenshoogte on the Ngogo River and was again mauled by Boer marksmen. His officers were shot off their horses one by one at ranges the British did not think were possible. Then came the disaster. On the night of 26th February 1881, Colley led a small force of about 400 men from the 58th Regiment, the 60th Rifles and the 92nd Highlanders up a tall, steep, flat-topped mountain called Majuba Hill that overlooked the main Boer positions. He did it without waiting for his reinforcements. He did not bring any artillery. He did not order his men to dig in. He believed that once the Boers saw British soldiers holding the high ground above their camp, they would simply pack up and run. It was one of the last great examples of Victorian imperial arrogance. It got Colley killed. At dawn on 27th February, the Boers looked up at the top of Majuba Hill and saw the redcoats there. They did not run. Instead, groups of Boer volunteers, led by a commander named Nicolaas Smit, started climbing. They moved from rock to rock, shooting steadily at every British soldier who showed himself over the edge. The shape of Majuba's summit made it impossible for Colley's men to see the attackers until they were right on top of them. When the Boers reached the top, the British line broke. Men ran. Colley himself was shot dead by a Boer marksman as he tried to rally his troops. Of the roughly 400 men on the hill, 285 were killed, wounded or taken prisoner. The Boers lost 1 man killed and 6 wounded. The British government of William Gladstone had already started to think that this war was not worth fighting. Majuba ended the debate. A truce was signed on the 6th of March 1881 and a peace treaty on the 23rd of March. Under the Pretoria Convention of August 1881 and then the London Convention of 1884, the Transvaal regained its independence. It was the first time since the American Revolution, almost exactly a century earlier, that Britain had been forced to sign a treaty giving up a pre-war possession. The slogan, "Remember Majuba," was born that year in the British press and never went away. The Boers had shown that a tiny nation of farmers could break a Victorian imperial army in less than 3 months. But the biggest lesson was still to come. Almost 40 years later, in a group of green counties much closer to London, another small people would pick up that same idea and apply it to one of the oldest parts of the British Empire. And unlike the Boers, they would drive the British out of their country for good. Section 6. The Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1921. Ireland had been under English or British rule in one form or another for about 700 years by the time the 20th century arrived. A long list of uprisings had come and gone and failed. The last big one before our story had been the Easter Rising of April 1916, when a few hundred Irish Republicans seized buildings in the middle of Dublin, declared an Irish Republic, and held out for 6 days against the British Army. When it was over, the rebels surrendered, and most Irish people blamed them for the damage to the city. Then the British executed 15 of the leaders by firing squad over the course of 10 days in May 1916. Those executions changed everything. Ordinary people who had not cared about the Republicans a month before now began to see them as martyrs. 2 years later, in December 1918, the first general election after the First World War was held across Britain and Ireland. A Republican party called Sinn Féin, which refused to accept any king or parliament in London, won 73 of the 105 Irish seats in a landslide. Instead of going to Westminster, the winners met in Dublin on the 21st of January 1919, formed their own parliament called Dáil Éireann, and declared Ireland to be an independent republic. That same day, in a place called Solo Headbeg in County Tipperary, a small group of volunteers from the Irish Republican Army ambushed 2 officers of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the local armed police force, and shot them both dead. Nobody had ordered that attack. The men had acted on their own. But from that morning, a war was on. The IRA that fought this war was tiny by the standards of any real army. They claimed about 70,000 men on paper, but probably only around 3,000 were ever actively fighting at any one time. They had almost no heavy weapons. The British, by July 1921, had around 50,000 regular troops in Ireland, plus tens of thousands of armed police. On paper, there was no contest at all. But the IRA was led by a young man from County Cork named Michael Collins, and Collins had worked out something the British had not. He understood that his small force could never win a straight-up battle, so he decided not to fight one. Instead, he built a spy network that reached right into the heart of British rule in Ireland, a place called Dublin Castle, and he went after the men who ran the British intelligence system, one at a time. The IRA began attacking police barracks all over the country in early 1920 to capture rifles and ammunition. Hundreds of small RIC stations were burned or abandoned. The British government, panicked by the collapse of their police force, rushed in 2 new armed units to fill the gap. The first was made up of ex-soldiers and was called the Black and Tans because of their mismatched uniforms. The second was made up of ex-officers and was called the Auxiliary Division. Both units were given almost no training and almost no rules. Within months, they had a reputation across Ireland for burning houses, shooting civilians, beating prisoners, and looting towns. A senior politician named Winston Churchill, looking back on it later, admitted that the British had ruled parts of Ireland during that year with a policy that had come to include, in his own words, an admixture of murder and counter-murder. The worst single day of the war was November 21st, 1920, a day Irish people still call Bloody Sunday. That morning, a unit of hand-picked IRA gunmen, known as the Squad, working on intelligence gathered by Collins, fanned out across the south side of Dublin and knocked on doors at 8 different addresses. Their targets were British intelligence officers, some of them a group of undercover agents nicknamed the Cairo Gang. Before breakfast, 15 men had been shot in their beds, their bedrooms, or on their doorsteps. Most were British military officers, along with a couple of civilians killed by mistake. The British intelligence network in Dublin was ripped apart in a single morning. Terrified agents fled to Dublin Castle for safety. That same afternoon, a mixed force of RIC, Black and Tans and auxiliaries drove up to Croke Park Stadium in the north of the city, where a football match between Dublin and Tipperary was being played in front of about 5,000 people. They were supposed to be searching the crowd for weapons. Instead, they opened fire. 14 civilians were killed, including a Tipperary player named Michael Hogan and 3 children aged 10, 11 and 14. That night, 3 IRA prisoners, including 2 senior Dublin officers named Dick McKee and Padda Clancy, were beaten to death in Dublin Castle by their captors. Bloody Sunday did not break the IRA, it broke British public opinion. In Britain, Newspapers started printing eyewitness accounts of what the Black and Tans were doing. World opinion turned. American newspapers ran stories week after week. By the summer of 1921, the British government, under Prime Minister David Lloyd George, was facing a hard fact. It had an enormous army in Ireland, and it was losing control of the country anyway. To keep fighting meant burning down whole towns and cities indefinitely, with the whole watching world against it. A truce was signed on the 11th of July 1921. Negotiations followed in London. On the 6th of December 1921, Michael Collins and a small team of Irish delegates signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty. That treaty handed 26 of Ireland's 32 counties to a new self-governing state called the Irish Free State. 6 counties in the north, with a Protestant majority, stayed under British rule as Northern Ireland. The cost of the war, according to the book The Dead of the Irish Revolution, was 2,346 lives, including 919 civilians and 523 policemen. By December 1922, the last British troops had marched out of Southern Ireland. It was the first piece of territory inside the British Isles that a European power had ever forced Britain to give up. A small force with almost no resources and almost no heavy weapons had just beaten the largest empire in the world. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 20 years later, on the other side of the world, a tiny people stranded in a land they believed was promised to them would pick up the same playbook. They would watch carefully how the Irish had done it, and between 1944 and 1948, they would force the British out of another ancient corner of the empire. Section The Insurgency in Mandatory Palestine, 1944 to 1948. The story of Britain in Palestine begins during the First World War, when British troops took the old Ottoman province away from the Turks. In 1917, while the war was still on, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, put his name to a one-paragraph letter, the Balfour Declaration, promising government support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. After the war, the League of Nations formally handed the territory to Britain to govern as a mandate, starting in 1920. Britain had now promised the same small piece of land to 2 different groups. Jewish communities across Europe began to arrive and settle. Palestinian Arabs, who were the great majority of the population, watched this with growing anger. Britain was stuck in the middle, and it did not manage the situation well. By 1939, with a world war looming, the British government completely reversed course. It issued a document known as the White Paper that sharply limited Jewish immigration to just 75,000 people over the next 5 years, with almost none allowed after that. The timing could not have been worse. In Europe, Nazi Germany was already persecuting Jews, and within months the death camps would be operating. Jewish families trying to flee for their lives found the gates of Palestine closed against them. Ships carrying refugees were turned back by the Royal Navy. Some sank with hundreds of people on board. For many Jews in Palestine, the White Paper was not just a bad policy, it was a betrayal that cost lives they had known personally. During the war itself, most Jewish fighters in Palestine put their weapons down. The biggest Jewish armed group was called the Haganah, which means the defense, and it was run by the semi-official Jewish agency under a leader named David Ben-Gurion. The Haganah told its people to cooperate with the British while Nazi Germany was the enemy. A smaller, harder group called the Irgun agreed and waited. But a third, even smaller and more extreme group called Leahy, also known to the British as the Stern Gang, never stopped attacking the British. In November 1944, Leahy assassinated the British minister-resident in the Middle East, Lord Moyne, in Cairo. It was a warning of what was coming. When the war in Europe ended in 1945, the world learned the full scale of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews had been murdered. Around 250,000 survivors sat in displaced persons camps in Europe with nowhere to go. The new Labour government in London, under Prime Minister Clement Attlee, still refused to lift the immigration limits. For the Jewish fighters in Palestine, this was the last straw. In October 1945, the Haganah, the Irgun and Lehi joined forces as the Jewish resistance movement and opened a full armed campaign against the British. In The Night of the Trains in November 1945, they sabotaged the railway system in more than 150 places in a single night. In June 1946, the Night of the Bridges, they blew up 11 road and rail bridges linking Palestine to its neighbours. The British hit back hard. On June 29, 1946, in an operation called Operation Agatha, tens of thousands of British soldiers and police fanned out across Palestine and arrested around 2,700 people, including senior members of the Jewish Agency. They also seized mountains of documents from the agency's Jerusalem offices, documents that allegedly proved the Jewish leadership had been coordinating the attacks. The Irgun decided to destroy those documents. The papers were being held in the British administrative headquarters, which occupied the southern wing of a luxury hotel in Jerusalem called the King David Hotel. On the morning of July 22, 1946, a group of Irgun fighters dressed as Arab hotel workers drove a stolen van up to the basement service entrance of the King David. They carried 7 large milk churns inside, each one stuffed with about 50 pounds of high explosive. They set the timers and left. Phone warnings were made to the hotel, to a nearby newspaper, and to the French consulate. The British later said they never reached anyone with the power to act on them. At 12:37 in the afternoon, the bombs went off. The entire 7-story southern wing of the hotel collapsed. 91 people were killed, including 28 Britons, 41 Arabs, 17 Jews, and 5 others. Another 46 were wounded. It was the deadliest single attack against the British mandate in Palestine. The leader of the Irgun who ordered it was a man named Menachem Begin. 31 years later, he would be elected Prime Minister of Israel. The attacks kept coming. In March 1947, an Irgun bomb killed 17 British Army and intelligence officers in the Goldschmidt House Officers Club in Jerusalem. That same month, the Irgun broke open Acre prison and freed a huge number of inmates. In July 1947, after the British hanged 3 Irgun men, Leahy kidnapped 2 British Army sergeants named Clifford Martin and Mervyn Pace, hanged them from trees in a eucalyptus grove near Netanya, and booby-trapped the bodies so that a British officer cutting them down was badly wounded. The photographs of the 2 hanged sergeants appeared in newspapers in Britain and caused public horror and anti-Jewish riots in several British cities. British soldiers in Palestine, most of them young national servicemen, began writing home asking what on earth they were still doing there. By this point, the numbers were becoming impossible. Britain had around 100,000 troops stationed in Palestine, roughly 1 soldier for every 6 Jewish inhabitants. The bill for keeping them there was crushing, a country already ruined by the war. Between August 1945 and August 1947, the British took 616 casualties, including 141 killed. On February 14, 1947, the British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, told Parliament that Britain was handing the whole problem to the new United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. On the 14th of May 1948, the Jewish leadership declared the State of Israel. The next day, the last British High Commissioner sailed out of Haifa harbour. By the end of June 1948, every British soldier was gone. The total bill for the campaign had been around 750 British military and police lives. An empire that had once controlled a quarter of the globe had just been pushed out of one of its most symbolically important territories by a handful of men with homemade bombs. 4 years later, in another corner of the empire, a completely different uprising was about to break out. This one would not be fought with milk churns full of explosives in a Jerusalem basement. It would be fought in the forests of Mount Kenya, with machetes and secret oaths taken in the dead of night. And the British response to it would become one of the worst chapters of the whole empire. Section 8. The Mau Mau Uprising / Kenya Emergency, 1952 to 1960. Kenya had become a British colony in 1920, and from the start the best land in the country had been taken for white settlers. A region called the White Highlands, some of the richest farmland in Africa, was reserved by law for European ownership. The people who had lived there for generations, mainly from a group called the Kikuyu, were pushed into crowded reserves or turned into cheap labour on the farms that had once been theirs. By the late 1940s, about half of all Kikuyu had no land at all. Nairobi's population had doubled in 14 years, as hungry people crowded into the city looking for work. A moderate political party, called the Kenya African Union, led by a British-educated leader named Jomo Kenyatta, asked for reforms. The British did not give them. Younger and angrier Kikuyu men began organising in secret. They bound themselves together with traditional oaths taken at night. The British did not know what to call this movement and settled on the name Mau Mau. In the early 1950s, Mau Mau fighters began killing loyalist Kikuyu chiefs, attacking isolated white farms and retreating into the thick forests around Mount Kenya and the Aberdare Mountains. On October 7, 1952, a prominent pro-British Kikuyu chief named Waruhiu was shot dead in his car near Nairobi. 13 days later, on October 20, 1952, the governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, declared a state of emergency. Jomo Kenyatta was arrested and later sentenced to 7 years of hard labour for running Mau Mau, a charge he always denied. The war was on. The Mau Mau fighters, who called themselves the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, had no modern weapons. They had machetes, known as pangas, spears, and a few stolen rifles. Some of their guns were homemade from water pipe. At their peak, there may have been about 25,000 of them hiding in the forests. Against them, Britain eventually deployed around 10,000 regular British and African troops, around 21,000 police, and about 25,000 armed Kikuyu Home Guard loyal to the colonial government. For many Kikuyu, this was not simply a war against the British. It was a civil war fought between neighbours, cousins, and brothers. The worst single night of the war came on 25th to 26th March 1953 at a village called Lari. Around 1,000 Mau Mau attacked the homes of a loyalist chief named Luka Kahangara and his supporters. They herded men, women and children into their huts, set the huts on fire, and hacked down with machetes anyone who tried to escape. About 74 people were killed outright, and around 50 more were wounded, most of them the wives and children of home guards who were on duty somewhere else. In the days that followed, loyalist home guards and colonial security forces took their revenge on suspected Mau Mau sympathisers across the same district. At least as many people were killed in those reprisals as in the original attack, and probably more. The British response to the uprising grew brutal very quickly. In April 1954, they launched Operation Anvil in Nairobi, sealing off the city and screening every Kikuyu, Embu and Meru inhabitant one by one. Around 20,000 suspects were sent to a camp at Langata, and 30,000 more were deported back to the reserves. Across the colony, around 150,000 Kikuyu were eventually held in a network of detention camps known as the Pipeline, where torture, forced labour and beatings were routine. About 1 million people were moved into fortified villages surrounded by barbed wire. Around 1,090 Mau Mau suspects were executed by hanging, a higher rate of judicial executions than in any other emergency in the late British Empire. The forest fighting dragged on until the main Mau Mau leader, Dedan Kimathi, was captured in October 1956 and later hanged. The thing that finally ended the emergency was not the Mau Mau. It was a scandal in a detention camp in a dusty corner of eastern Kenya called Hola. On March 3, 1959, 11 detainees at Hola camp were beaten to death by their African guards under British supervision. The colonial authorities first tried to claim the men had died from drinking contaminated water. Within days, the truth came out. The Hola affair was debated in the British Parliament and reported all over the world. A young Conservative MP named Enoch Powell stood up in the House of Commons and delivered one of the most famous anti-colonial speeches of the 20th century. Public opinion in Britain turned against holding on to Kenya at any cost. The British declared the emergency over on the 12th of January 1960. The estimates of how many Kenyans died vary widely, but the figure of more than 20,000 dead is generally accepted, and the true number is probably much higher. Only 32 European civilians and around 95 British soldiers were killed. Kenya became independent on December 12, 1963, with Jomo Kenyatta as its first Prime Minister and later President. Britain had held the colony by force, but the cost had been too high to keep on paying. At the same time that British soldiers were clearing detention camps in Kenya, another emergency was flaring up on a small Mediterranean island at the very other end of the empire. The fighters there would not carry pangas. They would carry bombs, and they would make sure every one of their attacks landed in the newspapers of Athens, London, and New York on the same day. Section 9. The Cyprus Emergency / Eoka Insurgency, 1955 to 1959. Cyprus is a small island in the eastern Mediterranean, closer to Turkey and Syria than it is to Greece. The British had taken it from the Ottoman Empire in 1878 and formally annexed it in 1914. About 4 out of every 5 people on the island were Greek Cypriots, who considered themselves fully Greek and wanted the island to join Greece itself. The word for that union is enosis. The other fifth, mostly Turkish Cypriots, did not want to be ruled from Athens. The British did not want to give the island to anyone at all. It sat on the sea lanes to the Suez Canal and the Middle East, and after Britain lost its main Middle Eastern bases in the early 1950s, Cyprus was promoted to being the new headquarters for all British forces in the region. London was not willing to let it go. In the early 1950s, a retired Greek army officer called Georgios Grivas began making plans. He was a hard, experienced soldier who had led an anti-communist resistance group in Greece during the Second World War. He secretly returned to Cyprus in November 1954, moved from village to village, recruited quietly from church youth groups and the Cyprus Farmers Union, and built a small, tight guerrilla network. He called the new organisation Eoka, which in English stands for the National Organisation of Cypriot Fighters. He gave himself the codename Digenis, after a legendary Byzantine hero. The political side of the movement was led by the head of the Greek Orthodox Church on the island, a charismatic young archbishop named Makarios III. Just after midnight on April 1, 1955, Eoka announced itself to the world. About 18 bombs went off across Cyprus in a single coordinated wave. The government radio station in Nicosia was blown off the air. Police stations, army camps and fuel depots were hit in Larnaca, Limassol and Famagusta. The first person to die that night was an Eoka member named Modestos Pantelis, killed by electric shock while trying to cut a power cable. The next morning, leaflets signed by the leader Digenis appeared in the streets, announcing a struggle to throw off the English yoke. The British in Cyprus were completely taken by surprise. Eoka never had more than a few hundred full-time fighters. Grivas knew he could not win a head-on war against the British army. Instead, he designed a campaign that would keep the Cyprus question in every newspaper in Europe and America until London decided the price of holding on was too high. Small teams placed bombs, ambushed patrols, raided police stations and shot down off-duty soldiers on the streets of Nicosia. Over the 4 years of the insurgency, Eoka carried out 104 house bombings, 136 separate acts of sabotage, 403 ambushes, 43 raids on police stations and dozens of attacks on soldiers. The British governor, Field Marshal Sir John Harding, declared a state of emergency on November 26, 1955, and eventually built up a garrison of about 40,000 troops on an island smaller than the state of Connecticut. The British hit back hard. They imposed curfews, collective fines, house searches and mass arrests. In March 1956, Harding exiled Archbishop Makarios to a remote island in the Seychelles, thinking that cutting off Eoka's political head would finish the movement. It did the opposite. Makarios became an international figure overnight, and sympathy for Cyprus grew in the United Nations and in the Greek and American press. Suspected EOKA members who were caught and convicted could expect to be hanged. Two young fighters, Michael Karaolis and Andreas Dimitriou, were executed in May 1956 and reportedly climbed the gallows singing the Greek national anthem. Later, secret British Foreign Office papers released in 2011 confirmed what Cypriots had long said. Colonial officers had tortured suspects during interrogations, and at least 14 Cypriots died in British custody. By 1957, Grievous's mountain units in the Troodos range were badly hurt, and most of EOKA's urban cells had been broken up. The British were actually winning the military side of the war. But the political side was a different story. Riots, bombings, international headlines, and the scandal of the torture camps meant that Cyprus had become a political nightmare for London. At the same time, the dispute was pushing two important NATO allies, Greece and Turkey, dangerously close to war with each other. To avoid losing both and destabilising the whole southern flank of NATO during the Cold War, the British looked for a way out. In February 1959, the British, Greek and Turkish governments signed the London and Zurich agreements. Cyprus would not join Greece. It would not be partitioned. It would become a brand new independent country instead, with Makarios as its first president. On March 9, 1959, Grivas declared a ceasefire. He left the island on a plane provided by the British. On August 16, 1960, the Republic of Cyprus was formally born. The British kept two sovereign base areas, Akrotiri and Dhekelia, which are still British territory today. According to one careful account, EOKA's campaign cost the lives of 371 British military personnel and 21 British police. A small organisation of a few hundred had forced the largest empire on earth to give up one of its most strategically important bases. But the old imperial map was still not finished crumbling. At the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, another small colony had been flying the British flag since the year 1839. A decade after the last shot was fired in Cyprus, it would become the place where the British Empire finally ran out of places to retreat to. Section 10. The Aden Emergency, 1963 to 1967. Aden is a hot, rocky port at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, sitting at the exact spot where the Red Sea meets the Indian Ocean. The British had first taken it in 1839 as a coaling station for ships sailing between Britain and India, and for more than a century after that, every British vessel had stopped there to refuel. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Aden became even more valuable. By the 1950s, with most of the old empire already gone, the colony had been promoted again. This time it became the main British military base in the whole Middle East, a replacement for the bases Britain had lost in Egypt and Palestine. In January 1963, London pushed Aden into a new grouping called the Federation of South Arabia, alongside the small tribal states of the surrounding hinterland. Almost nobody in Aden itself wanted to be in it. The trouble started almost immediately. On October 14, 1963, tribal fighters in the mountainous Radfan region north of Aden attacked a British convoy. The group behind the attacks called itself the National Liberation Front, or NLF. It was inspired, armed and paid for by Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was broadcasting anti-British propaganda into Aden every day through Cairo radio. On December 10, 1963, an NLF gunman threw a grenade at the British High Commissioner Sir Kennedy Travaskis as he walked onto the runway at Cormacsar Airport. Travaskis lived. A female advisor and another woman were killed, and around 50 people were wounded. A state of emergency was declared the same day. It would last for almost 4 years. The NLF was soon joined by a rival group called FLOSY, the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen. The two groups hated the British, but they also hated each other and spent a lot of the war killing each other's men in the backstreets. For the British soldiers stuck in the middle, that made the fighting even more dangerous. The attacks climbed steeply every year. There were 286 terrorist incidents recorded in 1965. In 1966, the figure jumped to 540. In 1967, the last year of British rule, it exploded to 2,900. Most of the fighting was not in open battle, but in the crowded streets of Aden town itself, especially the densely packed old district known as Crater, a bowl shaped by an extinct volcano. The worst day of the entire emergency came on June 20th, 1967. That morning, local troops of the new South Arabian army mutinied at a barracks called Lake Lines over the suspension of 4 senior Arab officers. The mutiny spread to the Aden armed police in Crater, who had been quietly infiltrated by the NLF for months. A Royal Corps of Transport truck carrying soldiers back from the rifle range was ambushed, and all 8 men inside were killed. A British patrol of Royal Northumberland Fusiliers entering Crater was then ambushed on a narrow street. 3 men from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, who were travelling with them, were killed, including Major Brian Malcolm. By the end of that day, 22 British servicemen were dead and 31 wounded. The British pulled out of Crater. The flags of the NLF and FLOSY were hoisted over the district, and arms were handed out on the streets. For 2 weeks, the British generals debated what to do. Any full attack on Crater risked huge casualties and could set off a general mutiny of every local soldier and policeman in Aden. The officer who broke the deadlock was a hard, sharp-tongued lieutenant colonel of the Argylls, named Colin Mitchell. The press nicknamed him Mad Mitch. Just before sunset on the 3rd of July 1967, Mitchell led his battalion into Crater in a night operation he called Stirling Castle. He took the pipers with him, playing Scotland the Brave and the regimental march Monymusk as the soldiers advanced through the narrow streets. The whole reoccupation was almost bloodless, with only 1 local man killed. Mitchell set up his headquarters in the Chartered Bank building and imposed what he called Argyll law. Later accounts said his methods were very rough, and a nearby detention centre, Fort Morbut, became known locally as the Fingernail Factory. By that point, Prime Minister Harold Wilson's Labour government in London had already decided that Britain could not afford to stay. The decision was pulled forward. On November 30th, 1967, the Union Jack came down in Aden for the last time. A Royal Navy task force of 24 ships, the biggest British naval operation since the Suez Crisis, lifted the last troops out. The Federation of South Arabia collapsed within hours of their leaving and was replaced by a Marxist government called the People's Republic of South Yemen. Around 90 British soldiers, 17 British civilians, and hundreds of local fighters had been killed. An empire that had once covered a quarter of the globe now had almost nothing left east of Gibraltar. 10 different uprisings, fought across 3 centuries and on 4 different continents, had each taken a piece of the British Empire away. Some, like the American Revolution or the Irish War of Independence, handed whole nations their freedom in a single stroke. Others, like Isandlwana or Majuba Hill, destroyed the myth of British invincibility and showed the watching world that redcoats could be beaten. Together, they tell a single story. The largest empire in human history was not brought down by one enemy or one war. It was chipped away, piece by piece, by ordinary people in ordinary places who simply decided that they were not going to be ruled from London any longer. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.